Warframe is well known for not being a player versus player game, but rather a player versus environment game. You know, it's your average looter shooter game. You just hop in and grind away, shooting mountains of enemies and creating all of these cheesy builds to adjust the times of your runs so you can be more efficient and so on and so forth. At some point though, the devs did create a sort of a player versus player game mode. They called it the Conclave. And while the Conclave was not well received, the reason being for that is that it just had a lot of problems, but the one that stood out the most was just how limiting and dull it was. You didn't get to customize your builds, and even after unlocking some of the mods for that mode, you still couldn't really go that far with your builds. It was just super limited. And so, as you would expect, a poorly made PvP game mode was poorly received and over time almost forgotten by the devs and most importantly the community. Even now you'll barely run into active Conclave players. Most of the time you'll just run into people abusing the system and cheesing it just so they can get the exclusive cosmetic Conclave rewards. But aside from that, the Conclave was forgotten and left behind. Although that didn't really stop a certain group of people from finding a way to partake in player versus player action. For there was a last hope for this in Warframe that DE implemented in the game and never really noticed how much potential it had. So the story sort of starts around the time where clans actually were more meaningful and alive, not just a place you would just join to get some blueprints. Back then, clans were competitive between each other. They always tried to one-up each other. There was the black sectors as well, so there was a lot of competitiveness in between these clans. So it happens that one small clan would start having these small events within its members of fighting each other's in their own dojo. There's this small room that you can build inside your dojo. It's called a dueling room. So this dueling room never really got used that often, if at all, because people weren't really interested in PvP. Well, since you could use your PvE builds in that ring, it never really felt like a good PvP fighting ring anyway, because you would have people just using their PvE cheesy builds, which would pretty much just end the fight in 2 seconds or so. So it was just a very dull and even worse than a Conclave experience. But going back to that small clan we mentioned, these people decided to fight in that ring, but under certain conditions. Melee only and no abilities or any PvE bullshit. Just pure clash of melees to see who's superior, who's better. Well, it does kind of sound cool when I put it that way, but realistically speaking, most of the time back then, it was just two people spamming spin attacks at each other. Since back then, dueling wasn't really that advanced, and most of the game itself revolved around spinning attacks, since there was no bullet jumping mechanics. So duels weren't even that complex, they were just pretty much simple and straightforward spin attacks. However, some people still did them, and over time the trend would go out to other clans, and then you would have some clan versus clan dueling sessions to see who's better. And as you would imagine, with that taking action, dueling did to some extent start becoming more complex, since people started adapting to it and creating their own ways to go about it. There were even a bunch of individuals that shined throughout that time, one of them being Death BG. He was a dedicated dueler throughout and throughout. He never really belonged to a clan, instead he went around with his stalker cosplay, challenging clans and absolutely destroying them. He even had a bunch of clans named after him, just complete dedication towards beating the guy. Eventually though, he would get beaten by a dueler that goes by the name of Fire Phoenix Earl. And well, these two duelers alongside a third one do have a story of their own and how they took dueling into the distance. But that's a story we won't be discussing today because we're going to be talking about dueling itself rather than the individuals that shaped it. So now that we know how dueling came to be, let's talk about dueling itself and what made it into a good PvP mode, a better one than Conclave. Well, dueling only really came to its true potential when the new parkour system got introduced into Warframe. It sort of ended up becoming this weirdly new genre of a fighting game. If I had to describe it, I'd say it's like a 3D fighting game where you get full control of your character in a third person view. Movement was king, and honestly still is. If you have good movement, then you will make for a great dueler. Obviously though, movement wasn't the only factor that went into dueling, and that's the beauty of it really. The variety of fighting styles that got generated in that ring are just insane. You had people dominating on the floor with their superior damage and combo mastery. You had people leaping into the air and just striking down their opponents. You had people baiting their opponents for mistakes and then punishing them. Some went for defensive play and relied on blocking. Some even went for pure strength and force and just two-handed weapons. There were many duelers back then and many styles. It was a good time for dueling, the best time honestly. Now, when it comes to dueling itself, the fights will always end in a one hit or two at best. Unless you're rocking a maxed out tanker build that could take some punishment, but even that would still fall out at around 4 hits at best. And that's like a really maxed out build. But that's just the nature of dueling. And well, for some people that seemed unbalanced and stupid. But honestly, that was the true charm of duels. You just couldn't afford to get hit. You had to utilize the movement system and turn yourself into a hard to hit target. And it's honestly not easy to actually hit someone with good movement. The only way you would get an easy hit is if your opponent is just practically standing still and is asking to be hit. And well, that was the case with the new duelers. They were actually incapable of utilizing the game's movement system. They would just stand still as if they're fighting another horde of infested enemies that practically does zero damage to them. The PvE game mode had made them lazy and bad. It ruined them. Still though, they would refuse to admit that it's their fault for not moving, and they would just insist that dueling itself is a stupid game mode that had no skill involved in it whatsoever, while refusing to learn it or get better at it. Some people would even go as far as just calling it luck. I never really understood that one, to be honest. And so, due to the nature of the player base and how involved they were in the PvE side of things, dueling never really made it that big, sadly, since the player base was just too used to spamming abilities with cheesy builds instead of actually playing the game and utilizing its movement system and mechanics. So, now that we've talked about dueling itself, let's talk about its downfall. How did this small community of duelers cease to exist if they really enjoyed it? Well, ironically enough, it ended the same way it started. See, just like we said earlier, DE made this game mode without really realizing its potential. And similar to that, DE ruined this game mode without really noticing the wasted potential. So over the time, this game has been evolving a lot obviously, and a lot of that was just new powers being introduced into the game. And well, those powers were balanced out for PvE for sure, but when used in the PvP, they pretty much broke dueling. It all started with the introduction of the melee riven mods, so that was pretty much where the meltdown began. Then you had stuff like the focus rework, and with that Unire pretty much would break dueling at all if used, since it reflects damage, so it's practically impossible to kill someone without dying alongside them. Then there was also the melee rework, which considerably buffed the range on most weapons and brought them up to the polearms level. So primed reach would be borderline broken at that point, and then you had people combining it with the ranged riven mods, so they practically just had to press the melee button and that would cover the whole ring pretty much with one hit. And it doesn't even stop there, because shield gating was also introduced into the game, and shield gating pretty much negated any other build aside from Toxin, since Toxin is the only thing that bypasses it. So everyone was just forced into using the same build of Toxin at that point. And it just keeps going because with the Arcane's buff, people could use Arcane Resistance, and that would just cancel the Toxin effect. And combo that with the auto block, and it's as good as you doing 0 damage to your opponent. Well, the list goes on and on, with the new helmless system being introduced as well. But the point is, duels were ruined by all of these overpowered new additions to the game. And as you would imagine, eventually most duelers would just get tired of it and call quits and leave. Fast forward to now, the only two remaining active duelers from back then would be myself and Fire Phoenix Earl, the oldest dueler I personally know, being a member of that small clan that sort of started it all. Recently, we did find a small Russian dueling community that did duels, but they used Riven mods and arcanes, so it's sort of like they've adapted to the chaos of this new power creeps. So you would think maybe they would carry on the legend of dueling, but it's really hard to imagine that since most of them don't even speak English. So that was pretty much a short recap on the dueling community in Warframe on PC. I've heard that dueling on consoles also has its own community, but I've only really had the chance of meeting one console dueler. Either way, perhaps this new crossplay update will rekindle the hope of bringing back duels, but it's really hard to imagine that with the current state of the game. So it's likely that dueling will just get swept into the history of Warframe, and that's exactly why I wanted to make this video. Mostly as a tribute to all the times I've spent in dueling with everyone. I've met so many people throughout this community and all of them were awesome people. And in all honesty, the most fun I've ever had playing Warframe throughout these 5,000 hours was while I was dueling these people. So that was the Legend of the Forgotten Art of Duels. Hope you've enjoyed it and well, thank you for watching it really.